Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Shula Neuman. I'm executive editor at St. Louis Public Radio, and I want to thank you and welcome you this evening for our 2021 virtual mini J School. This is the second session in this series. We're really excited to be discussing why we cover what we cover. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis, an institution that transforms lives through education. We want to thank our members for supporting us. Our more than 26,000 donors, many of you are among them, contributed more than $6 million last year, allowing us to bring you award-winning local news, podcasts, and of course, events like this. So tonight we're going to be talking about how newsroom leaders make decisions about news coverage. And joining us for this discussion are my counterparts from two other fantastic news organizations in town. We have Gilbert Bailon from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and Art Holliday from 5 on Your Side. Gilbert joined the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 2007 as editorial page editor, and he ended up getting promoted, and coming this May, he's going to serve as editor of the paper for almost 9 years. Gilbert came to St. Louis from the Dallas Morning News, holding reporting and editing positions before becoming vice president and executive editor in 1998. In 2003, he founded El Dia, a Spanish language daily at the Morning News, and became its publisher before moving to St. Louis. He's also a past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Now, Art Holliday's broadcasting career spans 4 decades in news and sports, including more than 40 years at KSDK. In December 2020, he was named interim news director at the station. Art came to 5 on Your Side in 1979 and worked as a sportscaster until 1989, when he began a 22-year stint co-anchoring Today in St. Louis with Jennifer Blome. Besides anchoring, Art served as managing editor and twice was executive producer of the morning newscast. Art's broadcasting work has been recognized with numerous awards, and I am abbreviating all of these recognitions here, but it includes 3 sportscasting Emmys. He was also inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Greater St. Louis Association of Black Journalists, and there's even more than that, but for the sake of time, I will wrap it up by saying that he is a native of St. Charles, Missouri, and earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Missouri, Columbia. So he is a through and through St. Louisan. So those are the introductions. I want to get down to the main topic of the evening, which is why we cover what we cover. So Gilbert and Art and I conferred last week in preparation for this seminar, and I asked Gilbert and Art who our audience is, thinking that it would help explain why our news coverage choices are sometimes different. But we all think, it turns out, that we are aiming to attract the same audience, which is a general audience across as many communities as possible. But still, our coverage does differ. So tonight, I'm going to start instead by giving us each a chance to talk about our respective mediums. So Gilbert, I'm going to talk with you. What is the media that you're in, and what distinguishes newspaper from what you see as different from radio and television?
Well, one big factor is that we've been around since 1878. We've been here for a long time, and how we do the news has obviously changed. It has for everybody. So what we have always viewed as a mass media, we try to appeal to a lot of people, but really what we're doing is serving a different group of audiences. There is no singular audience for the newspaper. And you can just look at it, flip through your Sunday paper, all those different sections we have. You've got sports, you've got lifestyles, you got business, you have the main news, we have national, but we emphasize local. So what we try to do is give you as the best breadth of information from a national to international to really highly localized version for the St. Louis region. We consider ourselves to be a regional newspaper. So that's really how we're different. We're archived, so people go back and look at the first draft of history. It's a cliche, but it's really true. You want to go what happened in 1931, you can look at the Post-Dispatch. You can go back to the pandemic of 100 years ago, and we have records for that. So we're knowledgeable that we're trying to record that, but we obviously cannot record everything. It's ridiculous to think that we can, but we serve an area of about 3 million people, Metro East included. So we'd have a broad area of coverage. I think so does television. I think how we go about it's a little bit different. They're going to be driven more by visuals because that's a visual medium. We do more stories, but everybody now is driven by social media and websites. So that is the commonality of whether it's public radio, Channel 5, us, whoever else in town, all the other, everybody has a website. And that has changed how we've done business, certainly in Art and I's time in the business. That's been a seismic change for how we do our business. Not necessarily different, but how we present and the quickness that we have to do to do our news. So.
Art, how would you describe TV news?
TV news is constantly evolving. In the 45 years that I've been doing it, just in the way we shoot stories, for instance, when I was at Mizzou in the mid 70s, I learned how to shoot on a 16mm camera. Fast forward to 2021, and you're using GoPros and iPhones with high definition cameras as a daily tool. But as Gilbert mentioned, one of the biggest changes has been the internet and our websites. It used to be that KSDK was a television station, and oh, by the way, we have a website, ksdk.com. Now we break all our stories online, recognizing that not everyone is waiting for the 4 p.m. news, the 5 p.m. news, the 6 p.m. news. By that time, they've been getting news on their devices all day long. And so we've had to think differently about our news product and how we present it and when we present it and where we present it. So all of those things are constantly changing. What it means going forward, I wish I knew. You know, if you had asked me 20 years ago, what's the future of television, I probably would have been dead wrong. You know, so, and technology drives a lot of it. I remember at my first TV station, I had worked there for 3 years, and they got their first microwave truck for us to do live shots. And now you don't even need a microwave truck anymore. We've got a backpack sized device called a TVU that allows you to go live from anywhere you can get an internet signal. So the technology drives a lot of what we do. The basics stay the same. You know, you have to have great storytellers. You have to have reporters who are curious and able to ask tough questions, able to hold the powerful accountable. You know, those things don't change, but a lot of the peripheral things are constantly changing. And it certainly affects the way we do our jobs, and it affects the way that our consumers consume the news.
I think your TV has probably had the most technological changes happening. I mean, for me, for radio, yeah, sure, the technology for how we collect audio has changed and how we actually put the stories together, but we're still kind of an appointment medium. That is to say that people are still driving in their cars and they are turning on the radio and they want to hear our newscasts at a certain time. And we can rely on that. However, terrestrial radio listenership is declining, and it has been for a while. And in fact, during the pandemic, it's really gone down because people aren't commuting like they used to. And as Gilbert said, for us also, I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago, we realized that we couldn't just be a radio station. We had to also be a digital medium as well. And we really invested a lot in our digital presence on our website and in social media. And that we also feel at this point that, you know, we're as much of a digital newsroom as we are a radio station, and where we publish first depends on what time of day it is for us. So if something is happening earlier in the morning, then we publish it online as soon as we can. If a news story breaks around 2 o'clock, we have to worry about the radio first because we know our listeners are expecting to hear it on newscast. So that's how it's changed for us. But it really is still, you know, as Art, what you said, it comes down to journalists being able to hold the powerful to account, being able to ask the right questions, being able to know their subjects, and that has not changed. So one thing though, that our priorities basically haven't changed as to what they are. But there's still a difference, at least between St. Louis Public Radio and KSDK and the Post-Dispatch, and that is we are a nonprofit news organization, and you guys are both for-profit, and that has absolutely affected the newspaper industry famously. Do you guys think it affected your coverage priorities at all?
I don't know that I can say it's affected our coverage priorities. I think those in large part remain the same. I mean, we're trying to do the best job that we can of telling St. Louisans what's going on in their community. And that, you know, depending on the story, that can take a variety of forms. But in general, we're trying to provide a snapshot each day of what's taking place, explaining why it should matter to you. You know, right now, pretty much everyone's lead story is COVID vaccinations. Well, clearly there is a great need for information. So, you know, we're trying to do our best to gather as much information and be accurate with that information in a situation where information is constantly changing. We've seen that in the last year, making an even more challenging story to cover. But does advertising affect our business? Of course. You know, I mean, in 2008, when the economy tanked, everyone in our company was furloughed, their salaries were cut. Contract negotiations moving forward changed. You know, when it was time for your contract to be up, you know, sometimes it was kind of a take it or leave it deal, whereas before there was actual negotiation.
But as far
I mean, we've seen even recently with COVID's effect on local news organizations. One of our competitors got rid of multiple people, including their lead anchorman. So there's no question that advertising plays a role depending on what's going on in the world.
that
Now, the flip side of that is when everything's going great, then it's a wonderful day.
right, but that addresses resources. You know, as far as what would drive advertisers is your proof that you are getting as many eyeballs as possible.
True.
So then does that impact what, whether you decide what story is first or what to include?
Well, I think you're always making one decision or another about what you think people are going to watch. I don't know how good we are at that. I mean, we do it all the time. I mean, I think that's all media. You're always trying to figure out, what do people want to hear? What do people want to see? What do people want to read? That's ongoing. And sometimes you're right, you're spot on, and other times you overestimate what people are interested in. I don't want to say it's a guessing game, but it's something that takes place in every editorial meeting, in every news medium. What do people want to hear and see and read? And that's not always easy to figure out. And quite frankly, some of the decisions that are made are decisions that are made because it's the right thing to cover, even though it may not be the sexiest thing to promote for the 10 o'clock news. So it's this constant juggling act between, okay, how can we figure out what people are going to, want to watch based on our promotion and that sort of thing, versus the stuff that we all know needs to be covered. And, so that's a constant, I don't want to say battle, that's not the right word, but it's a constant intellectual exercise that goes on in most news organizations all the time.
There's a lot to that actually, but Gilbert, what kind of discussions do you guys have in your editorial meetings?
Well, we clearly want to do coverage that's going to get read. That means there has to be some type of interest or import to it. but that's not the sole driver for us. We do a lot of reporting. We think that it's important that people know that information. It may not get the top of our heap on, analytics for that day, but it could be something out of Jeff City that could be really important. There's a story today out of Illinois where they passed the governor signed a criminal justice reform, which is a big deal. Now, is that going to get as much traffic as potentially a weather story or a crime story or something? Maybe not, but that's not the end run of what we do. We feel like we need to be doing, Art mentioned the accountability, the public service type journalism, but that's not all we do. We do a lot of other things. We have a feature story tomorrow on the first Eagle Scouts who are girls in the area. So we're looking for good stories. We want people to feel like there's a community here. I know we have often get ladled with the idea of, oh, you're looking for negative news. You're trying to quote sell newspapers. Well, the reality is we don't sell a whole lot of newspapers in single copy. In other words, at the store. There was a time when, yeah, we cared about newspapers did, but really most of our were either sold in advance. That means you get it on your doorstep. So whatever we write is going to be in the paper, or you're going to go to our website or social media and you access us through that. Now that's more of where you attract people who may not be subscribers. But the priorities haven't changed dramatically, but resources have. Where we used to, like a lot of big city newspapers, have bureaus around the world in Washington, and we cared about that. We're really much more local than we used to be. Not that we don't care about the rest of the places, but we have people in Jeff City, and we have people scattered around here in covering government, but it's smaller. We used to have what we called zones where you could get your St. Charles edition or your South County edition or your Metro East edition. And through resources have tightened, we still cover those areas. We're just not as intimately involved as we used to be. We wish we could, but it's a matter of resources. So what we try to do is cover the big stuff, but not necessarily every council meeting and every place. We can't do that. There was a time we tried to do that. That doesn't work anymore. We just don't have the resources. And there's a lot of other outlets for that. A lot of other media has sprung up that's doing that. So we have to pick our shots and think, what is the most people here are going to be most interested in? That's kind of the way we look at it. But it's not just clearly clicks. It's not at all, because we do a lot of heavy lifting on stories that take time and investigation that aren't going to be necessarily driven by how many people looked at them.
But the impact that they're going to have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the only difference in our editorial meetings at St. Louis Public Radio is, we of course we look at metrics. I would be lying to say that we don't look at the metrics to see how stories perform. But we don't have the pressure of advertisers threatening to pull if we don't get enough, if we don't have enough people reading our web stories or listening at the same time. That's really not there. We're also a much smaller organization in many ways, so we really are focused on what stories will have the biggest impact, what stories impact the most people, or what are the stories that need to be told that aren't going to necessarily be told in other places. And we do think about that. There is sort of the public radio style reporting that can be told in a way that's different than, there might be the same kind of story. Like just as an example, when we would report on how students are doing during the pandemic when they all have to learn remotely, right? Well, for radio, we have the luxury of being able to take 4 minutes, which is something that TV rarely has the luxury to do, and hear nothing but the voices of the students that are impacted. And that's a really unique thing. And we feel like those stories have the most effect on people and really help people connect with the larger problem at hand. And that's a luxury to have in the journalism business, I think. I want to recognize that we are definitely taking questions, and I already have a few. I want to encourage more people to send them in. But before I turn to any of the questions, I want to turn to one other thing. And Art, this is based on something that you said. We all talk about how we want or Gilbert also, you said, we have different communities that we are serving. And in a way, traditional journalism, and all of us, not to tip our hats to how old we all are, but we all have been in journalism long enough that that we've always been sort of like, we are the authorities and we shall tell you what's important for you guys to know, for you people, general populace to know. And that's really not the way that journalism is trending anymore. There's very much an awareness that communities have been left out because the people that are in the room deciding what gets covered aren't they're not being reported on. And we're not hearing from voices from their authentic positions. Gilbert, you mentioned that, we're only telling bad news stories, and, which you aren't. People accuse you of that. And frequently those stories that are about crime, for example, it ends up being in communities of color that have fewer resources. And that also has a negative effect on those communities, a lot of people will say. So I'm wondering how that part has evolved, how you've been talking about how we do a better job of covering communities, especially Black communities, and especially since Ferguson. And I'll let either one of you address that.
Well, clearly St. Louis has a gun violence problem.
Mhm.
And as you correctly pointed out, much of it takes place in communities of color. So how do you cover that in a meaningful way other than this shooting happened, this shooting happened, this shooting happened? And that's a common criticism of television news. We call it crime without context. Just reporting on the act of the crime without getting to any of the underlying reasons for the crime and potential solutions. And so that's part of our thought process at our editorial meetings. We know the crimes are going to happen because for decades they've always happened. And if we don't do a better job of trying to explain that, then shame on us because we're not doing our jobs. So we do try to, when we're discussing, how to tell these stories, what's an effective way to explain why this is happening, or what is a potential solution? And those types of stories can take various forms. You may talk to a criminologist or a sociologist, or you may go into the communities and try to get the reaction of people who are not breaking the law, but they live in communities where the law is broken every day and they're surrounded by it. We don't hear enough from those people who are adversely affected in their neighborhoods, and in some cases are trapped because they don't have the capabilities of moving. So there are a lot of ways to cover what's going on other than just listening to the scanner and sending a photographer out to get the latest flashing lights. You have to go because you don't know what's going on until you go. But then later on, when that story is revisited or amplified on, we have to do more than just say it happened.
Gilbert, with you guys, I mean, you basically still have the crime blotter. So which, when I look at your website and I see what are the most popular stories, frequently it is, the 3-paragraph stories about some crime that just seem like weird or scary or something like that. So how are you guys talking about this?
Well, we believe that we need to cover the major crime, clearly, because I think it's just important. We have a homicide map that we track that you can go online and you can track every homicide in the city and the county. We think that's important information. However, we spend a whole lot of time, what Art was saying, what is the context? Why is this happening? Who is it affecting? Who's working to stem the tide of this, which are many, many organizations, not just law enforcement, many others who are trying to do something about whether it's crime. We look at a mayoral race. We've been taking these issue oriented. Public safety was one of them. This last Sunday, we talked about housing. There's a housing problem in the city. There are many other problems. And sometimes people think you're just harping on that. We're often looking for what are some of the solutions, what's happening in other cities. We use data. We try to show, we had maps today on Sunday of how the kind of the disproportionate number of places that are getting vaccines distributed by the state. We all know that people of color are being more affected, particularly fatally, from COVID. This is important information. Now, what we do is we put that information out there. Policymakers can do something with that, but we have to provide that context. So I think we spend a lot of time because we're very cognizant of that. That isn't the bulk of what we do. We need to cover that, but we spend a lot more time thinking about what are those, not just solutions, what's working well, because we're talking a lot about, there's many other things. The school closings are going on in the city right now. It's very personal for a lot of places. Why is that happening? Very complicated situation. You have declining population, you have less money, but people want to keep their schools open. We understand that. So you have to talk to the people involved. But those are very personal. Well, if we're doing our jobs right, we're getting a lot of different voices. It's not just taking that one. It's not just the public officials. It's the people involved, giving them the airtime or the literal voice that they can have. And then people can make their own decisions how they want to vote or how they want to, behave in any particular way. Our job is, I think, I still is to kind of lubricate democracy, give people the information to make decisions, not to have to decide for them, but to give them that information. They can decide what they need to do in their communities. If their school board's doing something or there are issues of particular, give them the weapons that is information to deal with what they have in their lives.
I like the lubricating democracy. That's I want to stick with this because actually one of the first questions we got kind of had to do with the crime coverage. And I think this is pretty specific to the Post-Dispatch because as the paper of record for St. Louis going back 100 and how many years again? 170?
1878, whatever that, I didn't do the math, but 1878.
So have you guys talk about this right to be forgotten? Because now everything is digitally, Google someone's name, Post-Dispatch article will come up where you've been accused of something, but maybe not necessarily convicted. There have been discussions in other newsrooms, and I think I even heard a really good Radio Lab podcast about the right to be forgotten. Is that something that you are discussing?
Well, our policy is if we write that if somebody was arrested and there's an adjudication and their charges are dropped or they're acquitted or whatever, we do a follow-up story with it. We don't scrub the record. We believe that the record is the record, but if we make a mistake, we correct it or we update it when that information becomes verifiable. That's how we do it. I know that there's some places, again, keep in mind, we're not doing misdemeanors and fender benders and, pot possessions. These are usually felonies, usually major crimes, either violent or public, a lot of white collar crime, people stealing money, people going to jail who are elected officials, that kind of thing. So if you look at what the crime brothers, it's going to be the more severe crime. But keep in mind, in the city of St. Louis, a lot of crimes aren't getting solved at all. Nobody's getting arrested and solved. So what we try to do is we follow up to the best of our ability, and we will update if there's the situation comes up. It's not always violent crime. It could be somebody who had some other theft or something, but it has to usually be pretty something major before we're gonna delve into it. We just don't do the small stuff.
Cool. We have a lot of really good questions coming in now, so I think I'm going to turn to our audience. This is one that actually I think is really interesting. How much do your parent companies, how much do they influence what dictates what we cover here? And I guess that's Lee Enterprise for the Post-Dispatch and Tegna for KSDK and NPR for us. And I'll answer that question, and that is that NPR doesn't dictate anything that we cover locally. They don't. Sometimes they'll hear about stories that are going on in St. Louis and they'll say, hey, can you cover this for us? And if it's something we haven't been covering for ourselves, we say, sorry, we're not doing it. Or we'll find a reporter to free up to get the story for them, but they don't have any influence over our coverage. What about for you, Art, in Tegna?
Well, for Tegna, Tegna has over 50 television stations. The storytelling decisions are made locally. But let's take a look at a story that every single news outlet is covering, COVID. Okay, so what our company does is we frequently brainstorm. We'll gather people from all over the company. What are the best practices that other stations are doing that, let's say market A or TV station A is doing something that really worked well. And then that information is shared with the rest of the company. But in terms of, deciding individual stories and that sort of thing, that has not been my experience with Tegna. Now, where the corporation often comes in is sometimes how the TV stations look. We all get the same graphics packages because that's just economy of scale. You've got to produce it once. Why not produce it, and use it 50 plus times? So the music that we use, the graphics that we use, those are those are duplicated market to market. But that's not the editorial process that you were asking about.
Right.
Yeah, well, we make the local decisions here. So what our front page looks like, what our home page looks like, that's going to be decided here. But kind of what Art was saying, we don't have a Washington bureau. So they do put together, like our Nation World page is compiled out of a joint design center that serves 77 different markets. Many of these are smaller than mid-size, but we have markets like Buffalo, Omaha, Richmond, Virginia, some other places like that. But we all look different. We decide, and we're going to have a heavy local emphasis all the time on our website and also on our front pages and sports section, whatever lifestyles, wherever it might be. We have a local emphasis, but some of the things that are national and international, they will supply. And what I think we probably see it the most is online. So today, the Supreme Court ruled that Trump's taxes could be released. Well, you got a push notification under the Post-Dispatch. That was actually our Lee Digital Center because they do that kind of story because it's national, that we're in communication. So there's some input of that, but really most of the decisions, what you're going to see all the decisions locally, the headlines, everything are going to be done here in St. Louis.
We have another question that has to do, well, actually, we have so many good questions right now, it's hard to know where to start. I think, Art, this is mostly for you. How has streaming news 24/7 impacted anchors on shows that air on a particular day or time? Just in general, how has the 24/7 news cycle impacted all of us? I think is a really good question.
Well, for the people in the business, it means that if you sign up to become a television journalist, there's a chance you may work unusual hours. Yours truly was on Today in St. Louis for 22 years. When I started that show in 1989, it was a 30-minute show right before the Today Show. When I left 22 years later, it was a 3-hour show. So that's how much my sleep schedule changed over that 22 years. I was getting up at 1:30 in the morning to be at work by 3, and that means and what I didn't know was that for most of that time I had undiagnosed sleep apnea. So you can imagine how bad I felt most of the time. Yeah, I mean, it means someone's going to work weekends. It means someone's going to be working overnight. And that's just society in general. If you drive by a Walgreens, somebody's working in there at crazy hours. That's the ripple effect of a 24-hour society. Someone's going to be working hours that sometimes hurt.
Gilbert, you guys have, I think, also very much 24-hour newsroom going. Always have, though. I don't think that's been impacted by the change in how TV, how like the CNNs of the world are doing their news, has it?
Well, what's different is what we ask the people. So if you're a night editor on Sunday night and you're the only person editing, you're going to have to be able to care about the website as well as what's going into print. So it's training and having that idea of multitasking more, because the staffs are smaller, but we need to be able to cover those windows. Things happening on weekends or holidays, we have a limited staff. So we have to make sure that, but we've always had that to some degree. The difference is the speed. We'd say, okay, we can wait till tomorrow morning. No, it's happening right now. SWAT team has moved out, a bridge fell in, whatever it happened, we've got to be on the spot and have people to be able to respond to that, even if it's, at an odd time, as Art was saying, early in the morning or late at night. So it's different in how our staff works. I think we still have the expectation that we're going to be there, as quickly as we can with breaking news, particularly.
I think the way that it hasn't impacted, at least for us, and I would imagine for both of your shops as well, is that, unlike national networks, we don't have to be continually tuning airwaves or continually, having the latest up on our websites. Well, we try to be as timely on our websites as we possibly can, but it's not like with CNN where everything is a breaking news story because they have to make it exciting. Thank goodness we don't have to worry about that. Another question I saw here that had to do specifically, this has to do with social media, which I think is really also a great question. And the question posed was specifically about Black Twitter on the media discourse regarding race, and how has this powerful entity forced journalism to evolve in your experiences? I will speak from ours. I don't know that Black Twitter in particular has been impacting our coverage in our newsroom. I think the general conversation in journalism, maybe in response to Black Twitter, but it has absolutely impacted how we think of news, who needs to be included, and of course, especially who is working to make sure that we have genuinely diverse perspectives on what's going on in the world. And I think that's so I maybe I'm discounting the power of Black Twitter too much, I don't know, but I think that this is just the conversation that is happening nationally, as it should be happening nationally, as we all reckon with this. But I think it's especially happening within journalism because for so long, it has been too easy to represent one perspective. But have you guys had any discussions like that in your newsrooms?
Well, let's start with the personal and then I'll expand it. It's not a coincidence that I'm the first Black news director in 74 years at KSDK. Our company, Tegna, is being very intentional in hiring, retention, and trying to figure out how to create more management opportunities for people of color, recognizing that if you don't have a diversity of thought and opinion in your newsroom at a time when the country is daily debating issues that surround race, you're going to get left in the dust. And, so that's important. Now, in terms of Black Twitter and social media, clearly those are just social media in general has become much more of a phenomenon in terms of people communicating the way they get news or information, whether it's vetted or not. And that's played a huge role. A lot of the information that is generated on social media, some of it's coming out of Russia. Some of it isn't vetted. So it means that even though the mainstream media has taken a lot of hits the last 4 or 5 years, we're needed more than ever because there's so much disinformation, and it's intentional disinformation. There are entities that are trying to feed us the wrong information. And whatever your feelings about mainstream media, and I suspect most of the people here tonight, maybe I'm preaching to the choir, otherwise they wouldn't even be listening to us. And we appreciate those of you who support us, whether it's radio, newspaper, television. It's a challenging time for news media, and especially for news media that doesn't recognize the importance of diversity. And I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity. I see one question up here, and someone was asking, we're older, okay? We're older journalists, okay? How do you keep up with everything that's new? And so part of diversity in a newsroom also involves age. You've got to have a balance. You need young people to help you know what's current, but you also need people that have been around for 20, 30, 40 years for a historical perspective that really is important. So I'll leave it there. That was kind of a long-winded answer.
I'll try to chime in. Black Twitter really took effect during Ferguson, because I think it changed not just here in St. Louis, but throughout the world and the nation, where people had their phones out, had video, were doing things in real time. It showed the power of social media. That's also been true in other aspects around the world. But here for us, that was a big change also with the Stockley protests, where we had people who were doing reporting live. So they're all journalists, but there was media out there for people to respond to. And I also think that what's changed over the years is that there are focused, legitimate, good news organizations that focus on diversity. The Undefeated, the Grio. I was an editor of a Spanish language newspaper in Dallas, so reaching a different market. So doing journalism, doing solid journalism, doing investigative reporting. So there's that in addition to what you'd consider the mainstream media. There's many, many more outlets. And I think the ones that do credible journalism have really helped spread the worth of diversity, where it's not just us. They amplify, and we watch, we listen. We get ideas. We don't always get those stories first. We'll acknowledge that. So it's an important role that ethnic media is playing, but also people who are just doing blogging and really digging down into neighborhoods where we can't do that the way we used to do because of resources.
Yeah, not to mention also organizations like Real STL News, citizen journalists that are out there literally recording things as they happen without a filter. That's also like very powerful and has a lot of influence over the mainstream news organizations. And I want to get to more questions because these are so good. This is, okay, here's one question. Do any of you claim to be fair and unbiased? In other words, how do political views influence your coverage? This is like the journalism discussion right now, right? Like, who wants to
Well, let me, being a former editorial page editor, I think that there's a misperception of that there's a lot of more partisanship and we decide stories based on partisanship. But I also don't think that we're human beings. So is there any objective way to do a story? What we try to do is try to show as many sides and be as objective and fact-driven as we can. But the mere fact you did that story, the mere fact you put it in a certain place, is that an editorial decision? Yes. Is it partisanship? I don't think so. But we're highly polarized right now. Trust me, you can hear my voicemail any day, especially around the election. So there's and multiple sides. This isn't just one side feeling this way. So it is a fact that I think that people perceive that. And I think there's often unfairly saying that there's a motivation separate from the editorial page. The editorial page is opinion-based. Columnists are opinion-based. But the news we try to do is try to present it in a way that is balanced as we can. Are we always perfect? No. But we don't go at it saying, let's try to, shift view. Some newspapers do, and there are papers within this country that do it, or websites that have a partisan view. We're striving not to do that. I know we're accused of that, but we're really striving to try to present things as balanced as we can.
Well, I don't think you can really deny that some news coverage is biased. I mean, I don't even know how you would defend that. Now, does that mean all news organizations are biased? Of course not. So I'm old school. I was taught that the more complex the story, the more voices you needed to have in the story. You needed to have some sort of balance if there were opposing viewpoints or multiple viewpoints. Well, clearly, in some instances, this has gone away. So does it exist? Of course it exists. That doesn't mean that every news organization is biased. So, I think you can find whatever it is that you're looking for as a news consumer. If you're looking for news organizations that are at least making an attempt to have multiple viewpoints and have a nuanced style of reporting, you can find them. If you want to find a news organization that fits a certain narrative that agrees with your political and worldview, you can find that as well.
Right. I agree. I agree with you to a degree. I mean, we're human beings, and as such, it's impossible for us to truly be right. I think that individual journalists absolutely strive for impartiality, to recognize their perspectives and make sure that they are including multiple voices, and certainly the more perspectives, the better. The one thing that I have come to feel very differently about is that there are times when there is no reason to include the other side, and I think specifically about stories about climate change. I mean, at this point, is there really any purpose in getting a climate denier into a story about climate change when overwhelmingly we know that climate change is real, and people will hear me say that and think, well, that's a political decision, and maybe it is, but at this point in time, it just seems overwhelming that science is the science. So I think that there is a limit to striving to make sure that we get opposing perspectives in there. So that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, because I think it's such important. Another question I had, that this comes from somebody who sounds like he is or she is interested in becoming a journalist. So this is a good question for us. How do you get past the PR/HR department when covering a controversial topic? This is a big problem. My student newspaper, our editor-in-chief doesn't want to ruffle any feathers, even though we are independent of our university. This is a very relevant question. I think from my perspective, you get to a point where you're like, ruffling feathers is what we do. It's just, there's always room for discussion too. Even as it relates to the previous question, when I get calls from people who are upset that our coverage seems to be too right-leaning or too left-leaning, I find that just calling them back and talking them through, they're like, oh yeah, okay, it's not that bad. And the same thing is true for public relations people as well. And they understand, a good public relations person understands that we're not in the business of making them happy. So that's my answer to that question. I'm sure you guys have even better answers.
Well, I'm not quite clear about the question, so I don't want to answer it incorrectly without fully understanding it. So they're student journalists, and I'm not sure what the relationship is between the student journalists and PR people.
I am guessing, and maybe this is from Celia. So Celia, if you want to clarify your question for us in the chat, that would be helpful. But how do you get past the PR department when covering a controversial topic? I'm wondering if this is something that we at St. Louis Public Radio deal with, because we are associated, we are licensed by the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So there are times when the PR people at the university will not like what we cover when it comes to higher education, because either we paint UMSL in the best light, or we didn't include them in a story about higher education or something like that. That's how I am interpreting this. And I think—
Well, she just responded, our EIC, and I'm not sure what that acronym is, doesn't want to publish any sort of emotionally charged content. And that's not unusual for student publications. That happens at the high school level all the time. Sometimes it happens at the college level, although I suspect college students are less easily influenced by the people in charge and frequently do what they want to do anyway. But I wish I had. I really haven't had much experience in that particular realm, so I'm not really sure what the answer is. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Gilbert.
Yeah, I think that's
answering it very well.
That's happened a lot with high school papers, and there's lots of actual litigation about that. Is there a First Amendment form? And unfortunately, it's not always gone that way. I think the best way to do is sell whoever you need to sell this to. What is the public good of doing this story? If students aren't being served, or things are unsafe, or whatever you think that might ruffle feathers, or money's being channeled in the wrong ways, or there's a benefit, there's a public benefit. Try to get them to understand the reason you're doing this is not to ruffle feathers, but to improve a problem. Now, that may not work, but that's the best, that's kind of the moral, righteous way to approach it, as opposed to, I want to piss off the chancellor. I want to let them know that this affects students, or it affects people who pay taxes, or whoever it may be, as a way to pitch your story that there's a public import with this. And we need to do this. Make sure we do it fair, make sure we have all our facts together. We get them free reign to comment and refute whatever it might be, but we need to do this story.
Well, and the other thing too is with social media and technology, if you have a viewpoint, you can, you don't need you don't need a formal entity to disseminate it. Now, I understand wanting to be part of a student newspaper. There's value in that. But at some point you may have to decide what's more important, going along to get along or telling the story that you want to tell. And there are other ways to do that. Whether it's social media, you know, there's, you can find an audience. That's not hard. Could be a podcast, could be any number of things.
We have a question also that I think is really interesting. And this is both, it's directed for you, Art, but I think we could all talk about this. It's how is it decided what words will be used and what perspectives will be broadcast on political and economic stories? So, the language question, I know at St. Louis Public Radio, I can't tell you, it's almost like fun for us to debate what words we will use. Words are too politically charged. The most recent one that we've been discussing a lot is the term unhoused when we're talking about people who are homeless. So our philosophy has always been, we want to see the person with a certain condition. So it's a person with addiction, or a person with disabilities, or for a person who doesn't have a home or who is homeless. But now activists are using this term unhoused. People and for the editors at my station, we're all thinking that's activist language. Let's not, we're not going to use their language in our reporting of it, because we still want to say people who are homeless. And not just embrace the language that activists use. And this has been a constant back and forth between some of our younger reporters and our editors as well. So that's an example of the kinds of debates that we have about language. Do you have debates?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing that immediately comes to mind is, what do you call protesters? What do you call people who stormed the Capitol building?
Oh, yes.
Are they rioters? Are they protesters? And so, that was a discussion that went on almost immediately as we were approaching deadline and trying to decide in real time, what do we call what happened at the Capitol building? So absolutely, those discussions take place. And then ultimately, someone in charge has to cast the deciding vote. But, frequently, the floor is open for opinions. And I think that's the sign of a healthy newsroom, when you have those debates.
Yeah, I'd say echo what Art just said. And what somebody will call them rioters, other people will call them patriots. We try to do something that's going to be more neutral. We used on the front page after that, we use the word insurrection. We had calls saying this wasn't an insurrection. This was the Tea Party, again, revisited. And that was their political view. But since it was a political act in a political building, insurrection seemed to fit for us. Now, that's debatable. But yes, we absolutely talk about this all the time. And to Shula's point, we try not to adopt whatever side, because there's activists on many different sides of the aisle here. So we try to do something that's neutral but also descriptive, and it does change over time. But we try to do the best we can to not to take the activist view, because I think it can look like you're taking sides with that if you call people one of the either writer or a patriot. I think that either one of those could be loaded for some, although that was a riot. I think everybody could pretty much describe that as a riot. That was particularly event. So, yeah.
Yeah, my newsroom, we not only were we debating, what's it called them as far as insurrectionists or not, but some people in my newsroom was like, they have to be called domestic terrorists. They're obviously domestic terrorists. And that was like, well, no, that's a legal term, and that's a wait and see. You know, that was not a popular decision. I was not popular with that decision. Let me put it that way. We have time for maybe 2 more questions, so I'm going to start with this one. Do sensationalized news stories tend to gain more viewership, in your opinion, or do you believe viewers prefer to see the facts as they are? If people prefer to see sensationalized news, how does that affect the way the news outlets compete with each other while still attempting to report with impartiality? And Art, I think let's start with you on that.
Wow.
Tough question.
That's let's see. That's Sean. Sean, that's a hell of a question. So well done. Let me see if I can, if my answer is as good as your question. I think I think in certain quarters there is a belief that sensationalized news does get more viewers. The same way human nature makes you slow down to watch the wreck at the side of the road or the burning building or whatever. And sometimes that's reflected in the news coverage. There's an old saying in news, if it bleeds, it leads. And if you watch any given local newscast, especially in large cities, frequently the first block of the newscast is the random violence that happens. And, so again, I think the challenge is to add some sort of meaning to that, if that's going to be the way that you go. The other place that you see a lot of sensationalism is in the special projects that people do. If they have an I-team, for instance, and it's an I-team investigation, you may see promos run for a whole week, and they don't give away the story and they try to sensationalize it, and there's some real slick editing and music to get your attention, and sometimes that works for some people. So are we sometimes trying to be manipulative and trying to get people to watch? I would say the answer is probably yes. Not in all instances, but you'd be lying if you said that didn't exist. But that's been going on for a long time. Hopefully, and I've seen instances where the promotions department gets involved in promoting a story and they get it wrong in their promotions. And that has nothing to do with the reporter or the newsroom. And that used to irritate me, whether I was personally involved or not. I'm like, if you're going to promote our stories, at least get it right, because then that just, you have enough problems as it is with people disagreeing in one way or another with what you're covering. But then when the promotions are different than what the actual story is, well, that doesn't benefit anybody.
Last question. And this one is kind of, it kind of bleeds into what will be coming up in a few weeks on ethics, but I think it's an important one to talk through. Does the responsibility of covering stories authentically fall on the integrity of the publication or the individual publishers and writers? Yeah.
These are amazing questions. I'm serious. These are fantastic questions. So whoever, well done.
I will give credit where credit is due. It is from Sophia. So thank you, Sophia, for that. So the idea of the authenticity and the integrity and where that falls. For us, it's everybody's responsibility. A reporter, one of the first things you learn in journalism school is that your integrity to be able to get a story right is so important. If you get somebody's name spelled incorrectly, you lose, what's the word I'm looking for? You lose your authority, you lose your belief, right? If a bigger mistake gets through the editing process, which we're human, so of course it does, the higher up it goes and the bigger the mistake, it's the integrity of the entire publication, the entire station. So when we make mistakes and we don't catch them, ultimately it's my responsibility. And at the same time, it's also my responsibility if we are covering stories that are inauthentic or that leave out perspectives or certain people's voices, that goes to the integrity of, well, me ultimately, but certainly the editorial process in general, it is reflected poorly. So I would say it's the entire publication at that point whose integrity gets called into question. That's my perspective. I have a feeling you guys can add much greater wisdom than I can. So Gilbert, do you wish to address that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's true. It's everybody's responsibility, but really it's the newsroom's response, because, you know, the Post-Dispatch has a lot of other people working at it besides journalists, but the integrity really relies on us to do that kind of reporting. We have to ask the question, why does this matter? Who does it affect? What's missing? And you can't be perfect with all these things. Do we have the right sourcing? Who's telling us this stuff? Where did the tip come from? All these things come into play with when we do this to make sure we have that kind of integrity. And we're not perfect. I mean, as Shula said, we will get things wrong. We will miss angles. We will do that. But we certainly spend a lot of time talking about it. How can we do better and what did we do right? But it does reflect on the company. You know, so if we make a mistake, it reflects on the Post-Dispatch. It's an institution. It has been around for a long time. We don't want to do that. So we take a lot of pride in trying to get things right. If we get them wrong, we run corrections. Not all media do, but we run corrections, and we'll do it prominently if we make a mistake. And we'll put it online. We'll put a note saying, we got this wrong. And so I think that that's how we can show that we're trying to be as transparent as we can. But I think it is also, it's up to the reporters, but really the editors have to be the real, to your point, Shula, kind of the funnel through which things run, and we make decisions and ask good questions. We can prevent a lot of problems, but it is everybody's job from top to bottom to really be thinking about the integrity of what we do.
I would agree with most of what both of you said. It starts with the reporter, because they're the tip of the spear for that story. But it also involves management, because sometimes reporters are operating at the direction of management. And I'll give you a very specific personal incident. And this goes back a ways. I was a sports reporter, and this was during the Whitey Ball era. And there was a big national story out of Pittsburgh where a number of Major League Baseball players were being implicated as being users of illegal drugs. And one of our news managers wanted me to go interview Darryl Porter, who was the catcher for the Cardinals at the time. And even though he had nothing to do with this specific story, he had had some substance abuse issues when he was a member of the Royals, but that was his only connection to this story. And I said, I have a real problem with doing this because he has nothing to do with this story in Pittsburgh. And, you know, I was a young reporter. You know, I didn't really have my voice yet. If this happened now, I'd have a much stronger argument than I did as someone who was probably in their late 20s. And so I went to Darryl Porter's house. You can imagine how pleased he was. Not very. And I mean, he chewed me a new one. And then later on, a few days, maybe weeks later, you know, we talked at the ballpark and, you know, we hashed it out. But, you know, sometimes as a reporter, you can be put into ethical dilemmas because of your news managers. But ultimately, if a news organization isn't ethical, they're going to have problems. You know, at KSTK, we had an incident not that long ago in the Kirkwood School District, where we caused the school district to shut down because we were trying to do an undercover report about security at the school. And mistakes were made and people lost their jobs because of it. And it hurt our standing in the community. It certainly hurt our standing in Kirkwood. And so that's, you know, for short-term gain, putting your ethics on the line, it's never worth it.
Great. Wow, this has been a great discussion, and we barely got to everybody's questions. And some of those questions will be great for further discussions. So I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight for our virtual mini J session. Next Monday, it's going to be political reporting with the St. Louis Public Radio team, Jacqueline Driscoll, Rachel Lippman, and Jason Rosenbaum. I really want to thank Gilbert and Art. You guys, it was great having these kinds of conversations with you two at a personal level, but also to hear these amazing questions from our audience. So be sure to stay tuned. Check out St. Louis Public Radio events by going to stlpublicradio.org/events for information about other upcoming courses. And thank you all so much, and we'll see you all later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.